February 22, 1944. The skies above southern Germany roared with the engines of more than 800 B-17 flying fortresses, their contrails dragging white scars across the winter blue. Below, carved into the Swabian Jura hills, men in dusty overalls and Wehrmacht guards scrambled to conceal an industrial secret. Inside the subterranean halls of the Kaufering subcamps near Landsberg am Lech, laborers bent under the weight of stone and timber, their breath clouding in the cold, damp air. That day's inspection log, stamped by an international Red Cross delegate named Dr. Marcel Junod, made a brief note. Work carried out underground, conditions severe, caloric ration insufficient. What could drive a modern state to move entire factories beneath mountains? What fear was so great that the Reich abandoned daylight itself, burying its war machine under layers of limestone and secrecy? The Allies had unleashed what German newspapers bitterly called Terrorangriffe, terror raids. By late 1943, precision bombing campaigns were shattering cities and steelworks alike. The Reich's response was unprecedented. Build secret armories beneath the very earth. Aircraft assembly lines, once stretching across sunlit hangars, were pushed into dripping tunnels reinforced with concrete ribs, powered by generators humming in eternal night. Imagine the contrast. In Iowa, factory shifts buzzed to life with women in coveralls stamping out parts for the P-51 Mustang, a jukebox spilling swing music into the lunchroom. In Bavaria, under torchlight, prisoners chipped through rock to hollow out caverns big enough to house entire Me-262 jet production lines. A war of shadows had begun, not in the fields of Normandy or the deserts of El Alamein, but in the silent galleries of underground fortresses. Factories that could not be seen, and therefore could not be bombed, became the Reich's last desperate wager. But secrets leave trails. Allied reconnaissance pieced together fragments, unusual rail schedules at Neckarelz, shifts of 1,200 workers disappearing at dawn into forested hillsides, even the faint echo of diesel engines beneath thin mountain air. And when the bombs finally fell, they did not simply shatter steel. They brought entire mountains crashing down onto men, machines, and myths of invincibility. This is the hidden history of Germany's underground factories, where engineering brilliance collided with human desperation, and where the line between survival and collapse was measured not in miles of front lines, but in cubic meters of rock. The morning of October 14, 1943, dawned grey over the Franconian hills. By midday, the sky above Schweinfurt burned with black smoke and tumbling fireballs. On that day, remembered bitterly as Black Thursday, nearly 300 B-17 flying fortresses clawed their way over the city, dropping their deadly payloads on the heart of Germany's ball-bearing industry. When the raid ended, 60 bombers had been lost, over 600 airmen killed or captured, and still the Allied crews reported seeing factories smashed, production halls ripped open to the sky. In Washington, the U.S. War Department brief declared the German ball-bearing output crippled, though not destroyed. But in Berlin, the Reich Ministry for Armaments read the same numbers with a different tone. The industrial heart of the Reich was bleeding in daylight. Albert Speer, the technocrat-turned-minister of armaments, moved quickly. In November 1943, he issued a secret directive. Vital industries must be hidden. No longer could aircraft assembly lines or rocket laboratories remain vulnerable under thin roofs of corrugated steel. They must go underground into caverns and quarries, into the belly of the earth itself. At his ministry office, maps of the Reich were unfurled, mountains circled in red pencil, abandoned mines marked with green. From the Harz to Bavaria, an invisible war was being sketched. The scale was staggering. Within weeks, trains loaded with cement and timber rolled toward Nordhausen, toward Landsberg, toward the Neckar Valley. A rail log from the Reichsbahn at Nordhausen noted 3 daily shipments of Portland cement, each weighing 480 tons, earmarked only for special construction. What was being built there could not be spoken aloud in Berlin's cafes. But the rumor traveled fast among those who worked the rail yards. Whole factories were moving under mountains. Imagine the contrast. In Detroit, December 1943, workers poured out of the Dodge main plant at shift's end, their faces dusted with steel filings, jukeboxes in corner diners already spinning Glenn Miller's In the Mood. Across the ocean in Thuringia, hundreds of conscripted laborers marched by torchlight into the damp mouths of unfinished tunnels, picks and shovels clanging in the dark. The rock dust was like fog, one prisoner later recalled in a memoir preserved at the Bundesarchiv, and each swing of the hammer felt like striking at the heart of the mountain itself. By early 1944, the Reich's subterranean gamble had taken form. At Nordhausen's Mittelwerk, V-2 rockets were assembled in twin galleries nearly a mile long. At Kaufering near Landsberg, the Luftwaffe dreamed of jet production lines immune to Allied bombs. But secrecy demanded silence. Guards posted outside barred any mention of schedules, and deliveries were disguised. Coal trains were listed in timetables as agricultural supply, a Red Cross inspector. Dr. Marcel Junod, who visited in March 1944, scribbled cautiously in his report, "Conditions severe underground, health risks evident." Even those clipped words hinted at the enormity of what was unfolding. Here lies the hook of the story. Why did the Reich stake its survival on a war beneath the soil? Could moving factories underground truly shield them from the sky? Or did it only bury men, machines, and ambitions together under stone? The answer, as Allied bombs would later prove, was as fragile as the mountains themselves. Snow still clung to the peaks of the Harz Mountains in January 1944 when the first convoys rattled into Nordhausen. Cattle cars disgorged prisoners in striped uniforms, guarded by SS men whose boots echoed on frozen stone. They were marched into the shadow of Kohnstein Hill, where the gaping mouths of half-excavated tunnels breathed cold air like the lungs of a beast. What had once been a gypsum mine was about to become Mittelwerk, the most secret factory of the Reich. Every hour was counted. A Reichsbahn log preserved in the local archives records 3 trains arriving daily: cement, timber, steel beams. By February, the cavern walls were ribbed with concrete, scaffolds climbing upward into darkness. Electric lines snaked along the ceilings, powering lamps that burned day and night. The place grew into an underground city, 2 parallel galleries stretching nearly 1.5 kilometers each, with cross tunnels like ribs joining a stone skeleton. At the heart of this new city stood the machinery of desperation. Conveyor belts groaned, diesel engines pumped stale air, and skeletal cranes lifted fuselages into place. Engineers in overalls scribbled figures on clipboards, while 1,000 meters away, prisoners carried bricks barefoot across wet ground. "We never saw the sun for weeks," one survivor told a U.S. Army Signal Corps officer after liberation. His words typed into a terse report, time itself disappeared underground. The Reich was not building only at Nordhausen. In Bavaria, near Landsberg am Lech, 11 separate camps known as Kaufering the Firm through Edind sprouted around the Lech River Valley. Their task? Hollow out shelters where the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, could be assembled without fear of Allied bombs. Records from the local district office show shipments of 8,000 cubic meters of concrete poured into hillside hangars by spring 1944. Above ground, villagers could hear the muffled pounding of jackhammers, but few dared ask questions, and yet the silence was never complete. Allied intelligence picked up whispers from intercepted railway telegraphs, unusual quantities of coal routed to agricultural zones, or locomotives arriving at stations without cargo manifests. In London, analysts pinned red tags on wall-sized maps, puzzled at why small towns like Neckarels or Ebensee suddenly consumed more electricity than entire districts. A war of numbers was being fought in the shadows. The contrast to life across the Atlantic could not have been starker. In Chicago that same spring, the Tribune ran a photograph of women in headscarves and goggles riveting panels on the B-29 Superfortress. Their cafeteria menu boasted meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and coffee for 25 cents, a small luxury of wartime abundance. Underground at Mittelwerk, prisoners counted calories like coins. Each man allotted barely 1,500 per day, thin soup, a scrap of bread, sometimes a sliver of horse meat if a shipment passed through. Still, the dream of invulnerability pushed forward. Speer boasted in private that production would soon rise beyond the reach of Allied bombers. But his optimism was brittle. Each day underground brought accidents, cave-ins, crushed machinery, sparks that set timbers alight. A German engineer's memo from March 1944 complained that output is hampered by constant dust and dampness. Engines rust within weeks. Even the mountains resisted being tamed, And yet in those damp tunnels the Reich pinned its hope on survival. Whole cities had been brought beneath the earth, powered by stolen labor and driven by fear of the sky. But how long could they remain hidden? Allied bombers searched with cameras, not just bombs, and each shadow revealed another clue. The underground war had begun in earnest, and already the walls were straining. The war beneath the mountains was not built on concrete alone. It was sustained by timetables, locomotives, and coded paperwork. By February 1944, the Deutsche Reichsbahn had become the lifeline of Germany's subterranean factories. Each train, each carriage carried not only material but secrecy itself. A single log from the Neckarelz station, dated February 17, 1944, lists 12 flat cars of machine tools arriving under the classification Baugerät, construction equipment. In reality, those flat cars bore precision lathes, hydraulic presses and milling machines destined for tunnels being carved into the Odenwald hills. The movement of these trains was cloaked in silence. Freight listed as agricultural supplies left Hamburg at dusk, only to reappear on schedules near Ebensee, deep in Austria, where underground galleries stretched for miles. Conductors were ordered not to ask questions, station masters to reroute suspicious inquiries. The Reich understood that logistics was its second front, and only by hiding in plain sight could it keep Allied intelligence at bay. Meanwhile, across the ocean, America's War Department tracked its own numbers with pride. A bulletin in March 1944 recorded that in a single month U.S. shipyards launched 141 Liberty ships, each displacing over 7,000 tons. It was an astonishing contrast. One nation burying factories beneath stone to preserve its dwindling output, another launching floating factories faster than they could be sunk. Inside Germany, the logistical burden mounted. Coal deliveries increased by 20% in districts around Mittelbau. Electricity consumption spiked so sharply that local residents whispered about phantom towns beneath their feet. Farmers saw convoys of trucks vanish into forests at dusk, headlights extinguished, only to return empty by dawn. In Neckarelz, a small boy later recalled in an interview that the rumble of trains at night never stopped, but nobody ever knew where they went. The secrecy extended even to construction workers. Civilian engineers arriving at sites were blindfolded before being led into tunnels, sworn to silence by Gestapo officers stationed at camp gates. Tools and parts were unloaded in silence, and workers signed receipts stamped with nothing more than a number. It was bureaucracy as a cloak, endless ledgers disguising reality with neutral language, but secrecy cannot erase human detail. A U.S. intelligence officer later remarked that one of the first clues to these hidden factories was not a decrypted code, but a logistical mismatch. Why did a station like Neckarelz, built to handle 4 trains a day, suddenly process 12? The numbers betrayed what words concealed. While Germans strained to build in darkness, American industry thrived in light. In Long Beach, California, the Douglas Aircraft Company kept 3 shifts running 24 hours, women in denim coveralls sliding wings onto C-47 Skytrains under electric lamps. A company report proudly noted an average shift lasted 8 hours, with 2 breaks and a hot meal provided by the canteen. Compare that to Nordhausen, where prisoners worked 12-hour shifts underground, their meals totaling less than half the calories of an American lunch plate. And yet, despite the enormous imbalance, the Reich pressed on. Trucks rumbled through mountain passes, trains groaned across bridges at night, and paperwork shuffled through Speer's ministry in Berlin. The Reich's leaders believed that if they could hide their factories, they could prolong the war. That concealment itself was a weapon. But concealment carries its own dangers. What happens when a hidden empire grows too large to stay unseen? Could the Allies, with their cameras in the sky and their analysts poring over rail logs, trace the shadow of a mountain city back to its source? The answer was already in motion. Numbers on paper were becoming targets in the sky. The tunnels echoed like cathedrals, but their worship was to machinery. By spring 1944, Mittelwerk at Nordhausen hummed with assembly lines stretching through dim galleries. The air was thick, with diesel fumes and chalk dust, a haze that clung to hair, skin, and lungs alike. Prisoners and civilian specialists moved side by side, but never as equals. The specialists, usually engineers or technicians, wore clean coats and carried clipboards. The prisoners wore striped cloth, stiff with sweat and stone dust. Each man's role was fixed as firmly as the steel beams overhead. Routine was relentless. Shifts ran 12 hours or longer, often without natural light to distinguish morning from midnight. The daily ration amounted to little more than 1,500 calories. Thin turnip soup, a crust of rye bread, sometimes margarine measured in half grams. A survivor's memoir preserved in the Bundesarchiv recalls, "We could smell meat cooking for the German guards, but for us there was only the watery soup." The divide was not just in food, but in life itself. Contrast this with the factories across the Atlantic. In February 1944, the Chicago Tribune featured a photograph of Rosie the Riveter night shift crews at a Douglas aircraft plant. Their cafeteria menus offered meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and a slice of apple pie for 35 cents. Payslips showed women earning $45 a week, wages unthinkable for German civilians, and a fantasy for the prisoners hollowing out mountains. Even the background noise differed. In Chicago, swing music on the jukebox. In Nordhausen, only the grind of drills against rock. Women, too, filled roles in Germany, though not with the same recognition. At Kaufering, local Bavarian women were employed to drive trucks and operate cranes, their hair tied back beneath kerchiefs as they guided steel beams into cavern mouths. Yet while American posters glorified women in coveralls, German propaganda rarely acknowledged them. To admit necessity was to reveal weakness, and so the image of women at war was hidden, just like the factories themselves. Inside the tunnels, secrecy demanded silence, but human voices broke through. A Red Cross inspector in July 1944 noted briefly that discipline is harsh, complaints numerous, morale low. Prisoners whispered rumors of Allied advances, passing news through scraps of smuggled paper. German overseers barked orders, sometimes with a stick, sometimes with a glance. The atmosphere was heavy not only with dust, but with tension, an unspoken knowledge that these factories were both lifeline and tomb. The machinery itself was unforgiving. Sparks rained from acetylene torches, cranes groaned under the weight of fuselages, and the constant dampness corroded tools within weeks. Engineers scribbled angry notes about output delays, yet production never stopped. By mid-1944, Mittelwerk was rolling out V-2 rockets at a pace of nearly 600 per month, each one assembled under flickering bulbs in galleries deep inside Kohnstein Hill. Still, even this output came at a cost. Men collapsed at their stations, carts of stone derailed in narrow passages, and accidents multiplied. One German guard recorded in a report later seized by Allied investigators that the pace cannot continue, casualties mounting. But the Reich demanded results, and Speer pressed forward, convinced that concealment was still victory. The irony was stark. In America, workers punched clocks at the start and end of 8-hour shifts, ate sandwiches under electric lights, and returned home to apartments warmed by coal. In Mittelwerk, the only clock was exhaustion, the only warmth the breath of men laboring shoulder to shoulder. The factories were hidden, but the truth could not be buried. This was survival measured in calories, seconds, and scars. And outside, Allied reconnaissance cameras were watching. Each puff of locomotive steam, each shift in power consumption, became another clue. The underground cities were growing, but so was the map of their discovery. From 30,000 feet, the Bavarian hills looked deceptively peaceful, quilted farmland, winding rivers, red-tiled villages. Yet Allied photo interpreters knew better. In April 1944, reconnaissance aircraft from the Royal Air Force passed over Austria's Salzkammergut, snapping high-resolution frames with Fairchild K-17 cameras. On the prints, analysts noticed a pattern. New roads cut into forested slopes near Ebensee, trucks entering but never leaving, and piles of spoil heaped like molehills at the mouths of dark tunnels. Something immense was being buried in the mountains. Every image was a fragment. Analysts at Medmenham, Britain's secret photographic intelligence center, pinned prints onto wall boards, drawing red grease pencil circles around ventilation shafts, rail spurs and camouflage nets that looked too carefully placed. The more they studied, the clearer the puzzle became. Germany was building an invisible empire underground. By June 1944, the Allies had given the operation a name, Crossbow. Officially, it targeted V1 and V2 launch sites along the Channel coast. Unofficially, it extended to the hidden factories suspected of feeding them. A declassified OSS memo dated June 12, 1944, noted heavy movement of machinery into Nordhausen region, probable assembly works for long-range rockets. Intelligence. Officers argued, should they risk precious bombers against what might be empty tunnels, or wait until proof was absolute? Proof came not only from the sky, but from the ground. Resistance networks across occupied Europe smuggled reports to London. A French railway worker at Dijon described locomotives with sealed cargoes marked Sonderzug, special train, passing south each night. In Switzerland, neutral newspapers hinted at strange German construction projects consuming more cement than entire cities. Each report layered suspicion on suspicion until the evidence was undeniable. The Reich fought back with deception. Camouflage crews painted dummy hangars on airfields, built wooden planes to distract reconnaissance, and spread rumors of factories in places where none existed. Yet secrecy has limits. The more material moved, the more guards posted, the more questions arose. And Allied analysts had patience. Each misplaced shadow in a photograph was a breadcrumb leading deeper into the labyrinth. Meanwhile, life in the camps reflected the growing tension. At Mittelwerk, prisoners whispered that the mountain trembled when bombs fell on nearby Nordhausen, dust shaking from tunnel ceilings like powder. A surviving prisoner later told U.S. investigators, "We prayed for the bombs to come closer. Even if it meant our deaths, it meant freedom might be near." That paradox and fear of death mingled with hope for liberation haunted the underground war. Contrast this with London, where citizens still endured V1 raids. Newspapers like the Daily Telegraph printed photographs of cratered streets, yet also published maps boasting of new bomb shelters, debating Churchill's strategy in editorials. Their free press dissected the war openly, while inside Germany silence was enforced by decree. In Nordhausen, no man dared write the word Mittelwerk on paper. In London, journalists printed entire essays on the threat of secret German weapons. By late summer 1944, the Allies were closing in. Reconnaissance showed Ebensee's galleries expanding to lengths exceeding 2 kilometers, ventilation shafts venting steam into the morning frost. Intelligence officers debated whether even 12,000-pound tallboy bombs could shatter mountains. The question was chilling. If the Reich could finish these factories before the Allies found a way to destroy them, could the war itself be prolonged? The hunt for shadows was reaching its climax. Each photograph was no longer just an image. It was a potential target. And the underground cities, once thought untouchable, were now marked in red circles on Allied maps. Summer heat pressed down on central Texas in July 1943, when a Red Cross inspection team arrived at Camp Hearn, one of the largest German POW camps in the United States. Rows of neat barracks stretched across the prairie, each window screened, each bed allotted precise spacing according to War Department regulations. The inspection report noted a striking detail. Every prisoner received 3 meals per day averaging 3,300 calories, nearly double the ration given to forced laborers in Germany's subterranean works. For the German officers behind barbed wire, the abundance was disorienting. They played soccer on dusty fields, read camp newspapers printed with news approved by American censors, and debated politics late into the night. Yet even here fractures appeared. Some prisoners, staunch Nazis, treated their comrades with suspicion, while others cautiously explored ideas of democracy. A U.S. guard later recalled, "They argued more with each other than with us." The collision of worlds grew sharper in daily encounters. Many guards at Hearn were black or Mexican-American soldiers, men who wore the U.S. uniform, yet faced segregation in their own country. To German eyes, indoctrinated with racial ideology, the paradox was unsettling. Prisoner diaries described astonishment that African-American guards carried authority over Wehrmacht officers. The irony was brutal. Men who in Germany would never have shared a table with black workers were now lined up under their command for roll call in Texas. Meanwhile, back in Germany's hidden factories, ideological battles simmered as well. At Mittelwerk, groups of prisoners organized clandestine resistance, slowing production, sabotaging equipment, bending steel parts by a fraction of a degree. Others, under threat or belief, sided with Nazi overseers, enforcing discipline among fellow inmates. A camp notice seized after the war instructed prisoners that any deliberate damage will be punished by death, a line underlined twice in red pencil. The tunnels became not only factories but battlefields of ideology. Every rivet a potential act of defiance. News filtered in even underground. Allied broadcasts, caught on smuggled radios, carried word of the Normandy landings in June 1944. Whispers raced through the galleries. The Americans are in France. Hope mingled with fear. Some prisoners dreamed of liberation. Others dreaded the vengeance they might face from guards if sabotage was discovered. A survivor later told a U.S. interrogator, "We measured time not in days, but in rumors." The contrast between worlds sharpened further when prisoners in America received Red Cross parcels filled with coffee, chocolate, even cigarettes branded Camel or Lucky Strike. Across the ocean in Kaufering, a half-eaten apple tossed by a guard during shift change became a prize fought over in the mud. Two wars were being lived simultaneously, one of relative comfort in American camps, another of hunger and exhaustion beneath German hills. Yet both worlds revealed cracks. In Texas, American newspapers reported openly on the progress of the war. The New York Times headline of July 12, 1943, "Read Allies Advance in Sicily." Prisoners could read it, debate it and weigh truth against propaganda. In Mittelwerk, truth itself was contraband, smuggled on scraps of paper or whispered in the dark. Freedom of thought existed in one world. Silence was enforced in the other. By autumn 1944, those silences were breaking down. German POWs in America were exposed to jazz on the radio, to democratic debate, even to the sight of women running factories with competence and pride. Underground in Germany, the Reich's factories groaned under strain, their walls trembling with the distant echo of Allied bombs. Two worlds colliding through contrasts, each reshaping the men trapped inside them, and soon the bombs would not only echo, they would strike the mountains themselves. Dawn on April 3, 1945. The city of Nordhausen still slept beneath a thin veil of mist when the sirens wailed. Above, the steady drone of engines multiplied until the sky itself seemed to vibrate. More than 200 bombers from the U.S. 8th Air Force swept over the Harz Mountains, their bays opening in unison. Within minutes, Nordhausen was engulfed in a storm of fire and steel. Entire blocks vanished in cascades of dust, the ground quaking as though the earth had been struck with a colossal hammer. Deep inside the Mittelwerk tunnels, the tremors were unmistakable. Dust sifted from ceilings, lamps swung wildly on their cords, and men instinctively pressed against the damp walls. A prisoner later recalled in his diary, "The mountain roared as if it were hollow, and we feared it might bury us alive." For the first time, those who toiled underground understood that even stone could not guarantee safety. The raid was devastating. U.S. Signal Corps reports described Nordhausen reduced to rubble within hours, with rail lines mangled and supply depots obliterated. Though the tunnels themselves survived the direct hit, their lifelines were severed. Food and coal deliveries stalled. Locomotives lay in twisted heaps, and entire shifts of workers never returned. In one gallery, the vibration alone collapsed scaffolding, crushing machinery painstakingly assembled over months. The Reich had gambled on invisibility, but the Allies had shifted tactics. Their weapons grew heavier, their bombs more precise. The British Royal Air Force had already tested 12,000-pound tallboy bombs against submarine pens. Now similar strikes were envisioned against mountains. Could even granite resist when the sky itself rained earthquakes? Meanwhile, psychological cracks widened faster than structural ones. Prisoners whispered that liberation was near, their spirits momentarily lifted by each explosion above. Guards grew harsher, snapping at the smallest error, their own fear spilling out as anger. An internal German memo, later seized by American investigators, noted that discipline deteriorates under bombing. Morale unstable. Even the overseers knew the illusion of safety was crumbling. The contrast outside the Reich was equally sharp. In London, Civilians read about the bombings in newspapers the very next morning, debating in cafes whether the raids would hasten the end of the war. Editorials in the Times criticized the strategy, others defended it, but all agreed the blows were landing. Inside Germany, by contrast, silence reigned. Newspapers printed vague phrases about enemy terror, carefully avoiding mention of underground factories. Citizens were left to guess why trains no longer ran, why entire valleys thundered at dawn. Numbers told the truth where words did not. Production at Mittelwerk fell by 30% in April 1945 alone, according to surviving Reich records. Rockets once assembled in secrecy now lay unfinished, their parts scattered among debris. Allied advances closed in from east and west, squeezing the Reich's last strongholds, and still, even in ruin, men kept working. In the flicker of oil lamps, prisoners hammered at twisted beams, hauling debris as if the mountain might somehow be rebuilt. They labored with the knowledge that the Reich's dreams were collapsing above their heads, yet the machinery of compulsion gave no room for surrender. How long could stone hold back history? How many bombs would it take before the mountains themselves fell? The answer was coming swiftly, written in the roar of engines overhead and in the trembling earth beneath. The echo of the April raid still hung over Nordhausen when American troops pushed into the Harz Mountains. On April 11, 1945, soldiers of the U.S. 3rd Armored Division entered the tunnels of Mittelwerk. What their flashlights revealed stunned them into silence. Row upon row of unfinished V-2 rockets, steel giants lying on their sides like dormant monsters. Diesel fumes clung to the air, mingling with the stench of damp limestone. Machines stood mid-motion, abandoned as if the workers had simply vanished. Nearby, at Bölke Kaserne, U.S. Army Signal Corps photographers captured harrowing images of emaciated survivors, men who had been forced to dig, carry, and build until collapse. These photographs, smuggled quickly to Allied newspapers, brought the hidden war into daylight. For the first time, the world saw what secrecy beneath the mountains had cost. The Americans did more than liberate. They documented. Engineers catalogued the galleries, measuring the tunnel's length, 1.8 kilometers each, with cross passages every 50 meters. Reports were filed describing the electrical systems, the ventilation shafts, the storage depots. The figures spoke of immense ambition, but also of futility. A structure meant to last 1,000 years had crumbled in less than 2. Yet even amid the rubble, the Allies saw opportunity. Within weeks, V-2 components were packed into crates and shipped to Antwerp, then across the Atlantic. The underground factories had birthed nightmares, but they had also pioneered technologies the Allies would not ignore. In a twist of fate, the rockets designed in the darkness of Kronstein would propel the United States into the space age. For the men who survived, the aftermath was more human than technical. The U.S. Army organized relief stations, distributing rations of bread, canned meat, and chocolate. Prisoners accustomed to 1,500 calories now received double that in a single meal. A Red Cross report from May 1945 described men devouring food with both hands, unable to believe its abundance. The contrast was almost too much to bear. Starvation yesterday, excess today. The war's end did not close the tunnels, however. They became classrooms. By autumn 1945, American re-education officers had launched programs across POW camps in Germany and the United States. Libraries swelled. One report counted 10,000 volumes distributed to POWs in a single quarter. Vocational training in carpentry, agriculture, and mechanics began, designed to prepare men for civilian life in a world without the Reich. A German POW later recalled in a letter, "For the first time, books replaced rifles." The tunnels themselves stood as contradictions. On one hand, they were monuments to human suffering. On the other, marvels of engineering that engineers and historians alike would study for decades. Locals who passed by in the months after liberation described an eerie silence. No trains, no guards, only the black mouths of the galleries exhaling cold air into the valley. And as the Allies moved deeper into Germany, the pattern repeated. At Ebensee, at Kaufering, at Neckarels, they found half-finished caverns, rusting cranes, piles of unused cement. Mountains that once promised invulnerability now lay hollow, their secrets exposed. The underground war had ended not with triumph, but with abandonment. tunnels filled with silence, machines frozen mid-stroke, dreams turned into debris. And yet from that silence rose a new question. What would become of the men who had built these hidden cities, and how would the memory of their labor shape the post-war world? The war was over, but the tunnels remained, dark caverns that seemed to swallow sound itself. In May 1945, Allied investigators from the US War Department and the British Ministry of Supply descended into the Mittelwerk galleries, this time not as conquerors, but as archivists. Clipboards in hand, they catalogued everything. Lathe machines seized from French factories, precision tools marked with Krupp insignia, crates of guidance gyroscopes destined for rockets that would never fly. One officer, Colonel James Hamill, remarked in his field notes that the scale is staggering. The mountain is a factory as vast as Detroit, yet buried in silence. The silence was deceptive. Outside, the world clamored with demands for justice. Photographs from Nordhausen appeared in the New York Times and Life magazine, shocking American readers with images of skeletal survivors. Editorials questioned how the Reich could fund underground cathedrals of industry while leaving its laborers to starve. In Germany itself, ordinary citizens walked past Allied billboards showing the liberated camps, forced to confront what had been hidden in their own valleys. Trials soon followed. At Dachau in August 1947, US military courts indicted members of the SS and civilian engineers connected to Mittelwerk. The evidence was undeniable. Payroll ledgers showing payments to guards, transport manifests of prisoners delivered from Buchenwald, inspection notes by the International Committee of the Red Cross. One survivor testified, his voice steady, that he remembered the echo of boots more than the machines. That single line, preserved in court transcripts, struck harder than any statistic, and yet paradoxes abounded. Even as justice moved forward, pragmatism whispered from the shadows. Operation Paperclip, launched in 1945, quietly transferred over 1,600 German scientists and engineers to the United States. Among them was Werner von Braun, the architect of the V2. While some former overseers faced prison sentences, others were offered contracts and visas, their expertise too valuable in the coming Cold War. It was a division that haunted public conscience, punishment for some, redemption for others. For the POWs interned in America, the reckoning took a different form. Camps in Texas, Oklahoma, and Georgia now became schools. At Camp Hearn, German prisoners attended evening classes in English, economics, and American civics. In 1946 alone, records show more than 23,000 POWs enrolled in vocational courses across the U.S. For men who had once dug tunnels for rockets, the tools of war were replaced with textbooks, carpentry benches, and typewriters. One inspector wrote in July 1946, "The transformation is remarkable. They debate politics instead of orders." The irony was stark. Underground, prisoners had been forbidden to speak freely, their words measured by threat of violence. In American camps, they now argued about democracy, read Mark Twain, and listened to radio debates about President Truman's policies. A German soldier later admitted in a memoir that he first understood freedom not when released, but when allowed to criticize without fear. But reckoning was not only political, it was personal. Survivors carried memories like invisible scars. Some never returned to the tunnels, refusing to visit sites of labor-turned-mausoleums. Others returned decades later, touching the damp stone walls with trembling hands, as though seeking proof that their suffering had not been swallowed by silence. The mountains had hidden war, but they could not bury memory. The reckoning had begun, unfolding not just in courtrooms and classrooms, but in the minds of those who had lived through the underground darkness. In the years that followed 1945, the tunnels of Kohnstein lay abandoned, their entrances sealed with concrete, their galleries echoing only with the drip of groundwater. Yet the legacy of the underground war could not be sealed so easily. What had been forged in secrecy now shaped the open world of the post-war order. The Allies dismantled much of Mittelwerk's machinery, shipping tons of equipment across oceans. American cargo manifests list 341 freight cars filled with precision lathes, presses, and measuring instruments bound for ports in New Jersey. From there, pieces of the Reich's secret arsenal fed into U.S. research centers in White Sands, New Mexico, where V-2 test launches thundered into the desert sky by 1946. Each rocket's roar was both a warning and a promise. The technology born in forced labor would carry mankind within a generation to the moon. But not all legacies were technological. For German society, the reckoning unfolded in quieter but no less profound ways. Re-education programs spread across POW camps in Europe. By 1947, Allied records show over 120,000 former German soldiers had attended structured classes in civics, history, and trades. One British officer noted that the classroom is the true battlefield now. Former Wehrmacht privates emerged not only with skills, but with exposure to pluralism, newspapers and debate, tools for a democracy they had never known. Within Germany itself, the contrasts were jarring. Cities still smoldered. Ration cards limited families to 550 calories per day, yet Marshall Plan posters soon appeared promising aid and recovery. American food packages arrived in villages, tins of spam, sacks of flour, powdered milk, symbols of abundance from a nation once demonized as the enemy. A woman in Kassel later recalled her astonishment at tasting Coca-Cola for the first time in 1948, calling it a drink from another world. The underground factories became symbols in the cultural memory of a divided nation. In West Germany, they were reminders of tyranny's secrecy, used as case studies in new civics textbooks. In East Germany, Soviet authorities stripped what remained of the tunnels and relocated captured engineers to facilities near Moscow, continuing the race into space under another flag. Even here, the shadow of Konstein stretched across continents. And then there were the human legacies. Survivors carried their stories into schools, memoirs, and courtrooms. Some became civic leaders in the Federal Republic, shaping town councils and trade unions. In one documented case, a former Mittelwerk prisoner who had once riveted rocket casings underground later helped organize agricultural cooperatives, turning tools of war into seeds of renewal. Their lives embodied a quiet resilience. Men who had been forced to dig in darkness now worked under open skies. The tunnels themselves, long sealed, were eventually reopened in fragments. Visitors in the 1960s walked through damp corridors where rusting rails still ran, hearing guides describe how engines once echoed in these caverns. The silence pressed harder than any words, a silence that seemed to accuse as much as to remember. School groups left with the awareness that the ground beneath their feet could hide not just stone but history. By the dawn of the Cold War, the story of the Underground War had transformed from a secret of terror into a lesson for the world. It showed that mountains could not shield tyranny forever, that even the most elaborate concealments would collapse under the weight of truth. From rubble and ruin came rockets and classrooms, democracy and debate. The mountains had tried to hide war. Instead, they left behind a legacy that stretched from the bombed valleys of Nordhausen to the launch pads of Cape Canaveral, from ration lines in ruined Germany to the prosperity of the Marshall Plan. The Underground War ended, but its echoes carried far into the 20th century, shaping not just nations, but the very path of humanity.